time for share mode, and the one story that's being shared all week, Bruce Jenner's evolution into Caitlyn Jenner. Now, the question today is how Jenner's public transformation might affect children and how we talk to them about it. Joining me to talk about this is Joel Baum on the phone. He is the Senior Director of Professional Development and Family Services with Gender Spectrum. Now, Gender Spectrum is an organization that helps create gender-sensitive and inclusive environments for children and teens. Joel, thank you so much for joining us. Joel, my first question is, how will Caitlyn Jenner's reveal change the way in which your organization, Gender Spectrum, talks about gender identity with young people?
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I would say that it won't necessarily change how we're talking about gender with young people, but it certainly, once again, highlights for all of us how complex gender really is, and quite honestly, how infrequently we really explore gender and understand it and think about our own gender.
You know, but your organization, they focus on obviously educating youth. You've had a big movement in California and various schools out there. A lot of people online, though, you get some backlash from that, Joel. And that backlash is some kids are too young. Is grade school too young to talk about gender? I mean, at that age, can they really even understand gender identity, Joel?
Yeah, I think they absolutely can. I mean, let's face it, gender norms are everywhere, and the expectations that are attached to gender, our young people are very aware of them. I mean, you know, how many of us have children who told us they had to wear a certain color or do a certain activity because they thought that's what boys or girls are supposed to do? The fact is, young people are already in this conversation. It's a matter of how we're having that conversation and supporting them to really understand their own gender and to understand the gender of their peers in a way that is inclusive of all of them.
Joel, what would you say to those people that say by opening up this conversation, you're encouraging people to maybe think about their gender and say, hey, I'm transgender, when maybe they're not?
Yeah, I think that's not an accurate portrayal. Young people, all of us, know our gender quite early. You're not going to make someone be transgender simply by recognizing its existence. What we are trying to do is help all people, particularly children and teens, think about what it means when they talk about their gender. What does it mean when someone calls themselves a boy or a girl? I may not mean exactly the same thing as someone else does. In fact, I almost certainly won't.
Mm-hmm. Joel, I made a mistake yesterday on air, and I defined cisgender, cis-male differently than what it should be defined. So I actually want to go through some of the terms so everybody out there knows the terms, because it is one of the more sensitive topics when talking about Caitlyn Jenner, not making those mistakes and understanding more about gender, because while you're educating young people, a lot of us at this age, we don't necessarily know the terms that should be and are accurately related to gender. So let's go through a couple of those. Transgender versus transsexual. Joel, can you give me quick definitions of those two terms?
Yeah, and just before I do, I want to qualify one thing around the language, which is it is shifting beneath our feet. And what we describe as a term today may very well be quite different tomorrow.
Right.
What really is important is recognizing how someone is using a particular term to describe themselves. That said, transgender is typically a term that describes anyone whose gender identity, their sense of self, doesn't match or align with the gender they were assigned at birth. Transsexual is a term that, again, has many different meanings, but is typically used to understand someone who perhaps has had some sort of medical intervention. For many young people today, that's a term that has really fallen into disfavor, however.
And then what about gender fluid and gender creative? From what I understand, gender creative is an expansion of gender fluid. It's the act of being gender fluid.
Yeah, I mean, all of these terms, gender fluid, gender creative, these are ways of talking about any individual whose gender expression, in other words, the way they dress or wear their hair or the things they enjoy, is perceived to be different than what is typically expected. For them. And so we have been using the term gender expansive to sort of describe this whole group of people that are simply saying, this is what I mean when I call myself this gender, when I wear these clothes. It's a way to describe people who fit in this broader gender spectrum.
Allowing them to define themselves in sorts. Cisgender.
And then that's it. That's the key right there. Is we need to become more comfortable with the idea that each of us will define what we mean when we use terms versus assuming that we always are using the exact same term.
And Joel, I want to get to your gender wall, so let's get through this one. Cis male, cis female, cis male. And I'm basically a cis female, right? That's the definition. I was born a woman, I identify emotionally as a woman and physically as a woman. That is ultimately the definition of a cisgender, right?
Yeah, cisgender does mean someone whose gender lines up. And the reason that's such an important term versus just saying, oh, male and female is it names the dominant experience. And when we don't have a name, we end up defaulting to it.
So Joel, I want to get to your gender wall. You guys have a gender wall on the Gender Spectrum site. On this gender wall, you have an area that says, my gender is. A lot of kids use this area to talk about what their gender is. For instance, it says, my gender is stressing me out. As soon as I think I figured it out, it has to go ahead and get all jumbled up again. I sometimes wish I could just be at least a little more normal. But normal is boring. Anyway, Joel, why is this important to have a gender wall like this for young people to talk about their definition of their own gender?
Well, I think it's important for a couple of reasons. One is we're demonstrating that gender is very personal and that each of us are defining exactly how we're using particular words to describe ourselves. The other is to demonstrate to young people that there's a wide range here, that there are lots of space to operate, and that, yeah, gender sometimes is a little messy, but that lots of people are exploring it. And to me, that's the most exciting thing of all with Caitlin's transition, is that we're once again deep in a conversation about gender.
Getting into the conversation, talking about it, and learning about it, which is also very important. Joel Baum, thank you so much. Of course, if you're parents out there and you want to learn about how to talk to your kids about gender, you can go to Gender Spectrum and learn more about that. Joel, thank you so much for joining us.